In Section 4, we have a couple of additional points that are really important to make that apply to full container load moves in general, but certainly CY to CY moves too. Another key point related to FCL programs is that of container utilization. And this is something that, when not properly managed by an importer, can become very expensive, but without the benefit of knowing just how much it is costing the importer, what we like to call a phantom cost. Let's pay attention to what we have going on here. Container utilization focuses on working with vendors to make sure that they are making the maximum use of both the space and weight capacity of a given container. This is a subject we talked a lot about when we went through weight and measure and volume versus actual weight and all that stuff, but it is equally important from a container utilization perspective, making the best use of the asset, the container itself. Last bullet on this slide, best practices in the area of container utilization requires close coordination with suppliers and freight forwarders, but also between internal departments like purchasing and logistics. This requires a little bit of elaboration, so let's stop here for a second and talk about that. Surely we have to coordinate with suppliers because they're the ones making the stuff that we're going to import. They have to know their own product, the configuration of packaging, how many eaches go into a carton so that they can maximize the space in a container. The same goes for freight forwarders, not so much for shippers load and count moves, but certainly for CFS moves where it is the freight forwarder that is stuffing the container. The same concept. They have to make the best use of the space and weight capacity of the container. Internally, we have to coordinate with departments like purchasing and logistics for sure. Why is that? Because purchasing is placing purchase orders on these vendors. And in an ideal world, although it is super difficult to do, purchase orders to the best of one's ability would be great if they lined up with the capacity of a container. Again, that's really, really hard to do, but purchasing, at the very least, has to understand about the size of purchase orders and the capacity of specific container sizes. The same goes for logistics. In order to maximize container utilization, both the supplier and the importer must have item and PO level detail of what goes into each container. Of course, the importer places the PO. They ought to know what they're buying. The supplier, conversely, is making the merchandise. And as we said a moment ago, understanding, hopefully, the dimensions of cartons, master pack quantities, the weight of cartons, etc. So working together, the two parties, the supplier and the importer, can make the most use of containers. Ideally, and we've said this a couple of times now, the dimensions of every carton that go into a container should be known in advance, and vendors can cube out a container. That's actual terminology. Cubing out meaning, based on what a vendor has to ship, they know the DIMs, the master pack quantity, the weight of every carton, even though those cartons might have different weight and dimensional configurations. They know each one, and they can either manually or hopefully systemically figure out how many cartons fit into a container and can cube it out, make the most use of the space. To do that, we see in the sub-bullet kind of summarizing what we've said. Basically, use carton count, carton DIMs, and weight to determine how many containers will be needed for a given shipment. The old school way of doing that is manually. There are many, many software packages out there that will do that work on behalf of a vendor and or an importer. As a trade tip, suppliers must be able to cube out containers in order to place bookings for the correct number of containers. Think about this for a minute. Especially for vendors that have big production runs, that are shipping to multiple locations on an FCL basis, like we saw in our previous real-world example. Those vendors have to know, on an order-specific basis, how much merchandise can fit into a container. Otherwise, they won't know how many containers to order. What if goods are going to a single facility in Oklahoma City for distribution throughout the United States? That means that the vendor is shipping all FCL moves, all CY to CY moves from wherever the port of loading is to the port of discharge, but that can't even happen if the supplier doesn't know how many containers they need based on the quantity of merchandise they're going to ship. That is the theme of container utilization. In an effort to maximize container utilization and ultimately drive down landed cost, because that is what this is all about, it is a best practice for U.S. importers to mandate that suppliers only book containers for a minimum amount of cargo. We'll get to the quantities in our trade tip in just a second, but it is very, very common for importers, as part of a routing guide with an overseas vendor, as part of an SOP with an overseas vendor, to request a 40-foot container, you, Ms. Vendor, have to have so many cubic meters. So many cubic meters for a 40-foot high cube. That way, we as the importer can manage the utilization of the container. And as we see in our sub-bullet, no surprise, that the mandating of minimum quantities is measured in CBMs, cubic meters. An important caveat to this practice is that importers have to order in sufficient quantities that allow suppliers to fill containers to capacity. How is a vendor supposed to fill a 40 with a minimum of 50 cubic meters if the importer only orders in quantities of 30 cubic meters? That's what we're trying to say here. That is indeed an important caveat. As a trade tip, and these are not hard, fast numbers, they're just general guidelines, typical minimum CBM requirements that an importer can put upon their vendors: 20 CBMs for a 20-foot container, 50 CBMs for a 40, 55 CBMs for a 40-foot high cube, and 65 CBMs for a 45-foot container. We will be the first to admit that these minimum requirements are indeed lower than the actual capacity of each of these containers. This is a minimum requirement, and depending on the nature of the cargo, stackability of cartons and such, an importer might choose to raise or lower these standards. Again, these are not hard, fast industry standards. They are suggestions. Yet another factor that influences container utilization is the procedure assigned to floor loads versus palletized freight. And this one is quite important. Do we as an importer tell our vendors to stuff containers starting on the floor, cartons right on the floor of the container, and build up to the roof? Or do we say to that vendor, palletize our cargo and then load it into a container? That's what we're saying with floor load versus palletized freight. And as you might imagine, there's a big difference between the two when it comes to container utilization. First sub-bullet point, floor load means that cartons are loaded into a container loose from the floor all the way up to the ceiling of the container. Pretty easy to understand. Palletized freight implies that goods are placed on pallets prior to loading into an ocean container. Last slide in this section. Naturally, pallets are convenient for loading and offloading, but depending on the nature of the cargo, can waste a lot of space in the container, especially if pallets cannot be stacked one on top of the other. That's just a waste of a lot of space in the upper parts of the container, because pallets can only be stacked so high anyway, especially in ocean containers that are traveling on the ocean, bouncing around on a ship. Pallets can easily shift from left to right, tip over, etc. Floor-loaded containers have the advantage of maximizing the use of container space. It goes to say that the disadvantage is the extra time needed to load at origin and unload at destination. Depending on the size of cartons, it can take hours to load an ocean container at origin and can take hours to unload at destination. There is an expense associated with that. As an importer, we have to study the nature of our cargo, its stackability, its ability to withstand the rigors of ocean transportation, a bunch of different factors, and determine ahead of time, do we want our freight palletized by vendors or floor loaded? We're not here to say that one is better than the other. What we will say, emphatically, is that that type of tactical decision cannot be left to a vendor. It has to be made by the importer, or at least by the importer in conjunction with the vendor's input. And the forwarder too, for that matter. As a trade tip, and this certainly applies in the United States, many countries of importation require that wood pallets be certified as heat treated and or fumigated. That requirement has to do with unwanted pests getting into the country, such as beetles that sneak into a container on a wood pallet and eat up half of the forest in the Pacific Northwest. These are not imaginary scenarios. They actually have happened. It is for that reason that we as importers, if we stipulate pallets, that we use the right kind and that they're properly certified. Otherwise, U.S. Customs and Border Protection is going to get very upset about that. We'll stop here for Section 4 and pick back up in Section 5, still on the theme of full container load, but now talking about port-to-door moves.